I'm speaking with Dr. Adrastos Omissi, author of Emperors and Usurpers in the Later Roman Empire, Civil War, Panegyric, and the Construction of Legitimacy. Thank you for speaking with me.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So first, tell me how you got into studying and writing on this subject, and you can go as far back as you'd like.
The story, I think, probably begins when I was an undergraduate. I went to university originally thinking that I wanted to study medieval history, and the summer before I started, my father actually bought me a book on the Roman Republic, and I was instantly hooked. So I dashed off to university that autumn to do a course in what was supposed to be focused in medieval history, but I suddenly discovered that I wanted to do Roman history. So what I ended up doing was picking whatever Roman history modules I could find within the course that I was doing, and the only modules available were modules on the later Roman Empire, so that transitional period between what we might think of as the ancient world and the medieval world, which is not a period I'd ever really known anything about, and not a period I particularly had any interest in, but so long as it was Roman, I was happy. And over the course of studying that material, I became absolutely hooked, and since I guess the latter part of my undergraduate degree, sort of 2007, 2008, the later Roman Empire has been the thing that has commanded my attention and the thing that has taken up my time.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so considering the vast amount of material this book could cover, how do you lay it out? How do you break down the subject?
Well, so the subject itself, the book came out of my doctoral research. And the thing that I was interested in, and the thing that it seemed to me that there was a space to write about was civil war in the later Roman Empire, because the later Roman Empire was an era when civil war really was perennial. It just never stopped. Mm-hmm. And I noticed that no one really had written anything about this. Obviously, civil wars featured in lots of the historical narratives from that period because they really couldn't not. Mm-hmm. But no one, as far as I could see, had sat down and tried to rationalize why these civil wars were happening, whether there were patterns within them, what had changed in the later empire from the earlier empire when the situation was much more peaceful. And so I set out to write a study of civil war in the later Roman Empire. People that are sort of attentive to the subtitle of the book, Civil War, Panegyric, and the Construction of Legitimacy, the book eventually ended up being rather different from what I'd imagined. I'd wanted to write something that was very sort of empirical and very structural, looking at how usurpation and civil war took place, what kind of people became emperor, how people took power, how these wars played out. What I ended up writing was something rather different. It was a study of the mechanisms by which successive imperial regimes justified usually their seizure of power. Most imperial regimes in the later Roman Empire were ultimately founded by people who take power by force. Mm-hmm. And so I looked at how these regimes talked about the processes of civil war and how they dealt with their own, often quite undesirable prehistories, mm-hmm. if you will. So the book is about that. It's about thinking about how people conceived of and talked of civil war in the later Roman Empire, although behind that there is also a history of civil war in the later Roman Empire.
Mm-hmm. So looking over and just thinking about Diocletian, does it start with what's the date range that you cover then, would you say?
So I mean the main matter of the book was defined by the sources that I was looking at more than by the historical period, although it fits quite neatly into what I would say is a distinct period of the Roman Empire as well. Mm-hmm. If you want sharp dates, my earliest source that I focus on is 289, and the latest is 389. Mm-hmm. But so that 100-year window. But I also, the opening chapter deals with the first 3 centuries of the Roman Empire, and later chapters also look into the much later 5th and 6th century Roman Empire and the thing that people often then start calling the Byzantine Empire. But the core narrative, as you say, begins with Diocletian and looks at the period from the end of the 3rd century AD to the end of the 4th century AD.
So one of the, perhaps, I would say, ironic things about this is that it seemed to be a period that was highly bureaucratic as far as who has what stations, and I imagine everyone had their prescribed roles, and yet at the very top you had the head of this bureaucracy. It seems like there aren't any rules about who ends up being that person.
It's a funny contradiction, and I think it's a contradiction that arises out of the kind of absolute nature of imperial power. So you're absolutely right. The later Roman Empire, not by the standards of any political organization today, but by the standards of the ancient world or the medieval world, the pre-modern world, the later Roman Empire was highly bureaucratic, highly meritocratic in some ways, but it was a system of clear promotion, clear realms of responsibility for appointed officials, and so on and so forth. However, then at the top you have this figure of the emperor, and the problem with the emperor is that whatever successive regimes might pretend, and emperors like to pretend that they were bound by the law, and they like to pretend that they were kind of in service of their subjects. Ultimately, there weren't clear legal and constitutional limits on what emperors could do and how they could exert their power. I mean, many of the legal thinkers actually went so far as to say what the emperor does has the force of law. So an emperor's decisions are prima facie legal and right. Mm-hmm. What that means is, whilst everywhere else on the later Roman hierarchy, the generals and officials, they're working through a fairly regularized hierarchical process, emperors were operating on I think, slightly outside that and on a slightly different level. Mm-hmm. And that in itself is part of why we get so many civil wars and so many problems. I mean, for example, if you have a problem with an emperor, if a group of people or a region within the empire had a problem with the emperor, there's no mechanism by which to challenge, within the ordinary course of law, by which to challenge the emperor's decisions. And it's things like that then push people towards civil war. If you want to challenge an emperor, you have to be an emperor.
Mm-hmm. So in what ways did civil war take form? How did it, how did they erupt?
Yeah, so civil wars in the Roman Empire were almost always linked to usurpation. So that is to say, or linked at least to there being multiple emperors. So civil wars were almost never fought between anyone other than rival emperors. So that's, I think, an important thing to say at the start. And because of that, the most common reason why, the way that a civil war would play itself out is that, say, you have one emperor ruling maybe the whole empire or ruling a part of the empire, and within their territory, for one reason or another, and there are lots of reasons why people did it, but you then have someone who sets themselves up as a rival emperor. Once that happens, basically the only way that could play out would be through civil war. The pattern in the period tended to be a big split down the Mediterranean on an east-west axis. So you have a number of instances in the later Roman Empire. I'm sure all your listeners any of your listeners who know late Roman emperors, they'll know Constantine. That'll be a name that's familiar to people. And Constantine was one of these. He ended up ruling the western half of the Roman Empire, so sort of Italy and westwards. And his great rival and also his brother-in-law Licinius ruled the eastern half of the Mediterranean, so the Balkans, the Middle East, Egypt. And that was very often a geographical pattern that played it out. You had rival emperors in either half of the empire, and they would bring their armies together and they would duke it out. And as I say, because of the lack of constitutional restraint, that was in a sense the only way it could happen. Force was the only way for these conflicts to be resolved, for these contests to be resolved.
Mm-hmm. Now, when there was a civil war, how did each side or each rival establish dominion over the territory they were in? Was it pure military power, or was there sort of a cultural connection that people naturally gravitated towards one or another?
So we don't often get to see the processes that actually underwrote these civil wars in a lot of detail. We're often dealing with quite sparse source material. When we can see it, we know that there was a lot of traffic between different regimes, emperors trying to get specific armies to change side or what have you. So we know there was a lot of negotiating going on there, but the basic answer seems to be that it was ultimately about military power. Because what you don't get, I mean, I mentioned just before that you often would have the Eastern Empire facing the Western Empire. What you don't tend to get is a very sort of sporadic or very a very patchy series of small conflicts erupting here, there, and everywhere. You know, one city declares for one emperor, another city declares for another. What tended to happen is that the territories immediately under the control of Emperor X declared for Emperor X, and the territories under the control of Emperor Y declared for Emperor Y. And then the model is, as far as military conflict, was what the Romans were good at, what the Romans liked doing, which is full-scale, direct, full frontal military assault. So these weren't guerrilla wars. They weren't sort of patchy wars being fought here, there, and everywhere. These were enormous collections of Roman soldiers coming together in a single place, and very often these huge conflicts would be decided on the results of a single battle.
So it seems like afterwards then there really wouldn't be any revenge against particular cities or areas for having supported an emperor. It was just considered, well, that's how it is. You support who has control over you.
I think certainly, yeah, there was a certain pragmatism to it. You can see, again, we're limited by our sources. What tended to happen is the people immediately around a fallen emperor. So, again, the Emperor Licinius, who I talked about before, the opponent of Constantine, his immediate subordinates, the people closest to him, if they didn't die in the conflict that saw him dethroned, they would be executed. And sometimes specific cities might be punished, particularly if it was for acts of sort of tangible disloyalty. So later in the 4th century, an emperor called Valens was ruling the Eastern Empire, and a usurper called Procopius was declared in the city of Constantinople. Now, Valens, after putting Procopius's rebellion down, Valens took a whole series of punitive measures against Constantinople, things to do with tax privileges and so on. So occasionally when there was a specific city that you might be able to fix on and say, you know, this city has specifically wronged me, then yes, an emperor might undertake some kind of punitive action. But by and large, there was an awareness that soldiers and cities are going to declare for the emperor in whose territory they found themselves. So generalized reprisals against large groups of people, no, that didn't really happen.
So how did a usurper put together an army? Because it would have been probably obvious at some point that, hey, there's a force that's going to, create civil war.
Yeah, so there's most usurpers were either themselves generals or they had the backing of a very senior general. Rebellions and usurpations that didn't have that military backing fizzled out very, very quickly. This is part of a development that had been going on throughout the Roman Empire, but particularly had taken force in the 3rd century. That it had been realised that for all the other sort of things that helped to justify imperial power, helped to legitimise imperial rulers, what it all came down to at the end of the day was might is right, if you like. So the people that tended to take power were people who had immediate access to large military forces. As I say, very often they were generals.
So when these armies were formed, how much say did the individual soldier have in deciding who he wanted to follow? Where was the how was that made, that decision?
Yeah, so I think that decision was not generally made at the level of an individual soldier. We don't have a lot of evidence for And this may be a problem with our sources, of course. Again, we don't have the kind of evidence you would have for in the modern period for acts of disloyalty and so on. But we don't have a lot of evidence to suggest that there might be individual small-scale mutinies within armies. What we do occasionally see is generals refusing to take the side of a usurper. So, again, to give you a concrete example, in the year 350, there were two emperors ruling the empire, Constans and Constantius, the two remaining sons of the great Emperor Constantine. Now, Constans was executed by one of his generals, a man called Magnentius, and Magnentius then took control of the Western Empire. This happened in Gaul. Magnentius advanced into Italy. The armies in Italy declared loyalty to Magnentius. When he then got to the Balkans, the armies in the Balkans then made their commander, a man called Vetranio, they made him emperor. And that was ultimately a loyalist uprising to defend the Balkans against Magnentius, and Vetranio eventually was removed from power by the Emperor Constantius, and his armies were added to Constantius's forces. So you can see at the level of individual commanders, you can see people making a choice. Do I remain loyal to the current regime, or do I join the new usurper? Mm-hmm. But at the level of an individual soldier, I mean, it seems to be quite striking that Roman soldiers did as they were told in that sense. They followed their paymasters, and if you suddenly find yourself a soldier in Gaul and now there's a new emperor in Gaul, then guess what? You are now a soldier of that emperor.
Did the armies change their designators or any of their insignia when these changes were made, or how did that work?
Again, the nature of the sources we have make it difficult to say anything too concrete about that. Mm-hmm. Occasionally, when there appears to have been a religious dimension to these conflicts, or at least the possibility of determining a religious dimension, then we sometimes get Christian sources particularly who fix on these details, and so we suddenly get some indication of that. Mm-hmm. So, for example, the Emperor Constantine invaded Italy, which was then ruled in the year 312. It was ruled by an emperor called Maxentius, and he fought a battle at the Milvian Bridge. Again, this may be known to some of your listeners. It's quite famous. It's often seen as the moment at which Constantine converted to Christianity. Mm-hmm. Now, later Christian sources say that at that battle, Constantine had his soldiers paint the Chi Rho, the symbol it looks like an X crossed with a P. Mm-hmm. It's the letters Chi and Rho, the first two letters of Christ's name in Greek. Mm-hmm. That Constantine, the Christian sources say that Constantine had his soldiers paint the Chi Rho on their shields. So there we have just a chance mention in a number of our sources that give us an indication that, okay, this is one way that these two armies distinguish themselves. But in terms of changing insignia or changing modes of dress or changing their standards or anything like that, we simply don't have, unfortunately, the information to get a sense of what these battles look like. I mean, for me, it's a fascinating question. When you're in a big battle in a civil war, how do you identify those other units? How do you make sure you're fighting units that are on the opposing side? Mm-hmm. And I can only assume that, again, given this very bureaucratic nature of the late Roman state that you mentioned before, these soldiers would have a very good idea through shield designs, through standard designs. They would be able to identify, those are soldiers from the Balkans, those are soldiers from Gaul. So
you mentioned religion. How much this whole process, all these civil wars seem to be very almost bureaucratic in nature. How much did religion play a part in justifying or motivating?
Now, this is a question I think you would get very different answers depending on who you asked. My answer would be virtually none at all. That's not to say it wasn't frequently suggested that religion played a role. So we have, again, with Constantine, we have lots of Christian writers, particularly later Christian writers, who really Christianize Constantine's invasion of Italy in 312 or his wars with Licinius in the subsequent decade. And they turn them almost into crusades, that Constantine undertook these wars with his with emperors who had at one time been his colleagues. I mean, Maxentius and Licinius were both Constantine's brother-in-law. And lots of Christian writers say that this was basically undertaken in defense of the Christian faith. To my way of thinking, that is a ex post facto rationalization. Mm-hmm. And it's one particularly made by Christian writers who are trying to put their own particular Christian spin on affairs which were actually to do with, they were political, military, geographical, and not really rooted in religion. So I would argue that when you see religion being used as a justifying cause for these wars, when it crops up in the sources, it's a rationalization being given by writers who are promoting their own agenda, rather than something that was fundamentally driving the mechanics of what was going on. Mm-hmm. You have to remember as well that coming out of the pagan world, the religious wars were, at least in the Roman example, they didn't really happen in a sense. It was a very different religious landscape that didn't tend to impose this or that religious orthodoxy through violence. So the sense that there was a religious justification to a war between Emperor X and Emperor Y, I think was not often any truth in that.
So now I have a question about how were the people in the economy able to support all these various civil wars? You know, how did they survive all this fighting? And also, were there not external enemies that they had to worry about? How did that play out?
Yeah, that's a great question. And for me, it's something that I don't feel I answer in this book. Mm-hmm. And you know, I'm okay with that. It's not a question I set out to answer, mm-hmm. but it's something that since finishing the book I've been thinking a lot about, and I hope to write about in the future. Mm-hmm. Because the military model that you get of the Roman Empire, if you look in general texts written about the period, the military model you get of the later Roman Empire is an empire kind of beleaguered by external enemies. And that was true. I mean, warfare on the borders was constant. On the Rhine and Danube rivers against the tribes of Germanic Europe, in the Middle East, the region we now call the Middle East, against the empire of the Sasanian Persians. And that warfare on the border was virtually constant. Mm-hmm. However, what I would say, and what came out very strongly to me in the course of researching this book, is the thing that really animated emperors, and emperors were always the top of the military hierarchy, they were the commander-in-chief. Whilst the day-to-day business of their armies was policing that frontier and fighting foreign soldiers, the thing that really animated them, and the thing that they spent a lot of time thinking about and planning for, was fighting other Romans. And in fact, the entire setup of the later Roman army, I would say, you could argue, was geared to preparing for and trying to prevent civil war. So I think actually that the received stories we have at the moment about the later Roman Empire being slowly ground down by all these external enemies needs to be fundamentally re-examined. And I think if there is a military drain that was taking place in the later Roman Empire, it's this constant fighting between Roman armies. I mean, it should be said that battles between these Roman armies were unbelievably bloody. Mm-hmm. Unbelievably bloody. And they must have entailed, quite apart from the enormous loss of manpower that it entailed for the Roman military itself, the suffering and economic damage it must have done to the regions in which these armies were fighting, it must have been absolutely enormous. And these major battles between Roman armies were happening in the order of every 3 or 4 years. You might be expecting a major battle like this in some periods.
It almost seems like Rome was almost too rich for its own good if it could keep sustaining this kind of fighting and yet not feel pressure from outside.
I think there's possibly some truth to that. That this arose, the period of really constant civil war began in the 3rd century. And it emerged, at least in part, out of a period of, again, it depends exactly how you want to chop this up, but let's say 300 years of almost total Roman dominance of the Mediterranean. And I think that, yes, possibly part of the reason that the empire became so disordered and so internally violent is because there weren't serious challenges from outside. The irony being that when those serious challenges came in the 5th century, they fell upon an empire that was used to fighting itself. So if you look at what goes on in the 5th century, particularly in the Roman West, and that's a period that is often referred to as the fall of the Roman Empire, although in the Eastern Mediterranean it continued for many more centuries. But if you look at what Roman generals were doing in the 5th century, they weren't actually prioritizing fighting all of these barbarian hordes that were knocking at the gates of Rome. They were very often employing barbarian generals and barbarian armies to fight each other.
Okay. So let's turn towards the resources you used. What did you use for your research?
Well, as I say, this something that was initially conceived as a kind of quite empirical, mechanical look at the processes of usurpation in civil war in the late Roman Empire transitioned through the early stages of my research. What I very quickly discovered when I started looking at what sources I could use to undertake a study of this kind is that there's that old maxim of history that history is written by the victors. And in a period that's defined by this succession of civil wars, you only get one side of the story. And that narrative can often be incredibly dominating. So I've had several opportunities to mention Constantine already today. Constantine came to power through a usurpation. When his father, who was an emperor, died, Constantine was illegally declared emperor. And across the following 20 years, he fought a long succession of campaigns against other Roman emperors. Now, the problem for us as historians is when we look at Constantine, we only get Constantine's story. And actually, Constantine then handed on power to his sons. So even in the generation after Constantine's death, we're still only getting Constantine's story because Constantine's sons had an absolute vested interest in promoting the story that their father wanted the world to hear. And that's what led me to change my approach and to start looking at how people were talking about civil war, how successive imperial regimes were trying to legitimate their power, and how they were trying to deal with their often known very, very troubled past. So how did Constantine and the people that surrounded Constantine, how did they talk about his rise to power? How did they talk about all of these civil wars that he had fought? Because this is a very taboo subject in the Roman world, even though this was going on a lot. You weren't supposed to be fighting wars against other Romans. This wasn't something that you could talk about and glory in the way you could talk about fighting, say, Frankish tribesmen. So, and where this eventually led me is to looking at a source called panegyric, and I should probably explain that term for people not familiar with it. I've spent so many years staring at panegyrics that I forget it's not a very usual word. Panegyric was kind of it was a recognized form of oratory in the ancient world. It was part of a branch of oratory known as epideictic, or display oratory. And the only thing really in the modern world that we have that is like panegyric is something like a retirement speech that you might give to someone looking back on their years of service. A panegyric is a very formal speech of praise, designed for no other purpose than to glorify an individual person and to make them seem as wonderful as possible. As I'm sure you can imagine, in an empire, in a totalitarian empire like the Roman Empire, panegyric was a very, very popular and very common form of public oratory. And we have a lot of surviving panegyrics, more than 50 surviving panegyrics from the later Roman Empire. And so in the end, I decided to use this source and kind of confront the problem head on. If we're always dealing with these official histories, if we're always dealing with the narrative of the victors, then let's go where that narrative is at its absolute sharpest. and look at how this public panegyrical culture of praise towards the emperor dealt with the emperor's enemies. And so what this is a look at civil war, look at usurpation in that period, told through the panegyrics of the later Roman Empire.
So, did archaeological evidence at all help in your research?
The short and very blunt answer is no. I'm not an archaeologist by training, and certainly none of what I'm looking at in the book is, battlefield archaeology or anything like that. That said, I do employ certain archaeological sources, so the work is very focused on the way that emperors displayed their power, the way they attempted to rewrite and to control history. So I look quite a lot in the book at monumental architecture. Particularly monuments set up to commemorate, often in quite subtle and non-direct ways, set up to commemorate these great victories in civil war. So, for example, I mentioned before a war between the usurper Magnentius and the emperor Constantius. At the end of that war, when Constantius regained control of the Western Empire, he brought from Egypt this enormous red granite obelisk, which he set up in the Circus Maximus in Rome. That obelisk is actually still standing in Rome. It's now behind the Church of St. John on the Lateran Hill. But so I don't look at what a hardcore archaeologist would call archaeological sources. I'm not thinking about bones and pottery sherds taken out of the ground, but I do look at monumental architecture, at big buildings, at the ways emperors attempted to control space and use space and the expression of power through architecture as ways of impressing their legacy on the narrative.
Did you get to travel to any locations that figure?
No,
in
this is something that I did completely wrong as a student. Everyone always, when I talk to people outside the historical profession about what I do, they always assume that I'm going to be off traveling, excavating on a hillside in Turkey or poring over the ruins of Pompeii or something like that. I did all of my research in a library in the United Kingdom. It was a very poor choice on my part.
Which library was it that had all this information accessible?
So I was doing my doctorate at the University of Oxford. So I was working in the Bodleian Library there, and also the Sackler Library, which is the classics collection there. Those are two of the best libraries in the United Kingdom and indeed in the world. So I was very spoiled to have these resources on my doorstep. I almost never needed a book that I couldn't find in the Bodleian. But yeah, it was a mission on my part to come up with a research project that meant I never had to leave the UK.
Do any British museums have anything interesting that connects with what you researched?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I mean there are certain sort of things in lots of the museums in the country that have a kind of tangential relation to what I was doing. So the British Museum, the Oxford, the Ashmolean in Oxford, both have fantastic coin collections. And one of the very few ways that you can look at the regimes of defeated usurpers is by their coins. That's one of the only things that we have that survives from the ancient world that was actually produced by defeated usurpers. So readers of the book will note that throughout the book I often look at coin types, and I think about what messages usurpers were trying to promote based on what kind of coins they were minting. But yeah, in general, this is it's quite a literary piece. I'm looking very much at text, at political culture, and at history.
Okay. Would you consider yourself an expert on these Roman coins at this point?
Oh no, not at all. I wouldn't claim to be an expert at all. I could happily pretend to be an expert so long as there wasn't a real expert in the room. But no, I wouldn't claim to be an expert at all.
So, what part of the research was most enjoyable?
I mean, it's a great privilege to be able to earn your daily bread by sitting in a library and reading books. And that's a very generic answer, but I've always felt incredibly lucky that I was able to do that with my time, to read and to write, and for that to be how I earned my living. Mm-hmm. It was very exciting. It's a nerve-wracking thing doing a doctorate, because you launch into this 3 or 4, and in the United States they're even longer, 3 or 4 year period of research. And because you have to do something that is genuinely new, you have to contribute to scholarship in a way that has never been done before. You're always taking a bit of a leap into the dark. So you create a project that you think will work, but you don't really know until you undertake it. Mm-hmm. And there was a moment I can remember in the 3rd year of my doctorate, as I was beginning to start writing everything up and get ready to submit it. And I can remember thinking, "Hey, this works. This, I've managed to write something that contributes to scholarship that I'm proud of and that says something genuinely new." Mm-hmm. I suppose one final thought would be, I've been focusing very much on my doctorate there. Subsequently, I then undertook a further period of research to develop what I'd done in the doctorate and turned it into the book that people can now read. Mm-hmm. It was a great feeling after all those years to actually hold the damn thing in my hand to see it as a physical object. Mm-hmm. That was really exciting.
What did you find that was most surprising in your research?
The thing I think I would say that surprised me most, surprising might be a slightly wrong term for it, because it wasn't kind of a moment of shock. It was a slow dawning realization. Mm-hmm. The thing that I found very alarming in reading this book is it really turned on its head lots of the easy assumptions I had about what history is. Mm. I went into the project, I think, with a model of history as there is the past, which is this objective thing which has this independent existence. And as a historian, you're simply trying to describe this objective thing that is the past in the most accurate terms possible. Looking at all these sources that I knew were intentionally trying to manipulate the historical record, that I knew were trying to blacken the names of political figures, were trying to rewrite the past in certain ways, and knowing that we can't get away from that. Those are the sources we have to work with. Mm-hmm. It was quite an unsettling moment to realize that when we're trying to study the ancient world, we're working with a body of material that is so corrupt, you might say, or so difficult to handle. Mm-hmm. And I think I came out of writing this book viewing the past in a very, very different way, mm-hmm. And really shaken out of that easy idea that the past exists independent of our study of it.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I would say historians, even modern historians, would face the same issue with when dealing with certain individuals.
Absolutely, yeah.
What was the most difficult thing, perhaps issue to research? And again, knowing that you have limited materials to work off of, was there an issue that you particularly grappled with?
Yeah, I mean, that's an easy one to answer. The most difficult thing, unquestionably, was the linguistic barrier. Mm. So, as I mentioned several times, this book came out of research I undertook as a doctoral student, and I came to graduate study really only speaking English. I'd done a little bit of French at school, but I was basically a monoglot. Mm-hmm. Now, the sources I was reading, obviously, were all in Latin, written in Latin and in Greek. And a lot of the scholarship I was dealing with was French, German, and Italian, and particularly German. So that, for me, was an enormous challenge. I mean, there was one point during my doctorate when I was trying to learn 4 languages at once. And that was a big barrier to overcome, the linguistic barrier that was presented there, particularly with the primary evidence. because the kind of work I was doing with the sources, even when I could get these sources in English translation, and a lot of the material I work with you can read in English translation. And if you can't get it in English translation, you can get it in another modern language. German, French, Italian are the main ones. Mm-hmm. But because of the way I was dealing very closely with the language of the sources, I always had to be thinking, even if I'd initially read them in English, I always had to be going back to the Latin and the Greek. And these panegyrics are written in the most intentionally convolute and elitist and stylized rhetorical form. I mean, this really is the sort of pinnacle of rhetorical expression of the day. Mm-hmm. So this is even for a native speaker of Latin or Greek, these would have been challenging texts to understand. Mm-hmm. And so to come at those whilst I was still finding my feet with these languages was very, very difficult to do.
So over the more or less 100-year period, did you see a marked change in the style of these panegyrics?
I'm a little nervous about answering that question, and I'll tell you why. As I say, we have about 50 of these speeches from the 100-year period I was looking at. 48 is the exact number, although I suppose the number will change depending on exactly what you class as panegyric. But 48 is the number I tend to give. Mm-hmm. Now, whilst that's actually an awful lot, we don't have that many panegyrics from any other period of the Roman Empire. So comparative to other eras, that's a lot of material. Mm-hmm. In absolute terms, relative to what the number of speeches we know must have been delivered, it's a tiny, tiny sample. Mm. And so I'm a little bit nervous about generalizing about changes in the genre based on what I know to be a very tiny sample. To give a concrete example, towards the end of the 4th century and into the 5th century, there was a writer called Claudian. Hmm. Claudian wrote in Latin, and he wrote panegyrics in verse. Most of the panegyrics I look at are panegyrics in prose. Hmm. But he wrote sort of epic poems that praised emperors, that praised consuls, that praised generals. Now, some writers suggest that this is a movement to a poetic form in the later 4th and the 5th century, that Claudian represents this sea change in the culture of public oratory. I feel very uncomfortable with that suggestion because we don't have enough evidence to say either that there weren't lots of verse panegyrics being produced before, and actually you can find hints of them, or to say that there weren't prose panegyrics carrying on being produced in the 5th century. So I get very nervous about making generalizations in that way. What you can see happening, or what I do feel more comfortable talking about, is across the 4th century, you can see the models of how to talk about civil war that were being developed become more and more concrete, if you like, or almost generic. By the time you get into the 5th century, there's a very well-established rhetoric that you can use to talk about usurpation and civil war. And that is something that I think my book kind of watches develop. At the beginning of the book, these panegyrics talking about usurpation, I think were in the late 3rd century were breaking new ground in some ways. By the end of the 4th century, this is absolutely de rigueur.
Well, I guess I would imagine as a Roman citizen who craves peace, it's probably pretty sad to think it became pretty standard.
Yeah, I mean, it absolutely is. So St. Augustine, who wrote, an enormously prolific writer, and of course very famously wrote The City of God, which is this big study of a sort of Christian theological view of the course of history. Mm-hmm. But he writes in the City of God about the sort of tragedy of perennial civil war in the Roman Empire. Mm-hmm. And I think to people living in the Roman Empire, it had just become a fact of life. Mm-hmm. Now, to most people, it wouldn't be a fact that impacted them on a daily basis, unless you were unlucky enough to live in one of the places where these battles would be fought out. Mm-hmm. Or elite enough to be involved in high politics, then a lot of this must have passed you by, mm-hmm. in some senses. But nevertheless, it just became part of the background noise. I mean, it really was. It was something that every single person would have lived through several periods of major civil war in the course of their lifetime.
Mm-hmm. So I know this is really old material, but did you come across anything that emotionally moved you, either positively or negatively, even something amusing, perhaps? One of the things I always said about the Roman Empire is they were a deeply serious group of people. Mm-hmm. So there wasn't a lot of, they're not particularly the texts I was looking at. There's not a lot of jokes in them. Mm-hmm. The thing I think the thing that kind of reached out to me most emotionally in the course of doing this work is there's a number of instances of this happening, but I'll talk about one specifically. An emperor called Magnus Maximus, who's a usurper. He took power in Britain in the year 383, and he was eventually deposed by another emperor, Theodosius, in the year 388. So he ruled the Western Empire for 5 years. Now, Magnus Maximus, in keeping with the practice, a very common practice at the time, Magnus Maximus made his infant son, Victor, he made him co-emperor. Now, we don't know how old he was, but he can't have been older than about 10, and he was possibly a lot younger than that. Mm-hmm. When Magnus Maximus was deposed from power, because Victor had been given this imperial title, he was executed. And just coincidentally, at the time that I was specifically writing that section of the book, I just had, me and my wife had just had our first child. Mm-hmm. And so that touched me in a very visceral way. Mm-hmm. It brought home the reality of the violence of this period and the violence of this kind of conflict. I mean, there's the old quote, one death is a tragedy, 1,000 deaths is a statistic. Mm-hmm. And I was reading about these enormous battles, these incredibly bloody civil wars, but that little boy being executed as the result of the actions of his father, that was something that reached out across that gulf of 1,700 years and really touched me and really affected me. Yeah. Do these various panegyrics, do any of them contain information that could provide details or an understanding of Roman military strategy, operations, or tactics?
So this is something that people who look at the panegyrics often get very frustrated about. Mm-hmm. Because the short answer is no, or not in the way that military historians would like, at least. Mm-hmm. As I say, these panegyrics are written in a highly stylized, highly rhetorical language. They're very indirect. They're very elusive. So the kind of core information about battlefield deployment, about troop types, about troop movements that military historians use as grist to the mill, you're not going to find that stuff really in these panegyrics. That said, if you read them very, very carefully, you find details emerging from them that are helpful in painting pictures. I mean, very often it's the panegyrics that are the most detailed surviving narrative of these civil wars. Mm-hmm. You always hope that you're going to have really good historical sources, historian X or historian Y, going through these civil wars in a really detailed way. The way, for example, Tacitus wrote about the year AD 69 and wrote about the civil wars that took place in that year. Often that's not the case in the later empire, and we don't have those detailed historical sources. So then we're forced to go to these panegyrics and do everything we can with these often quite turgid texts that don't yield easy answers very happily.
When they discuss individuals, do they at all give it an indication of maybe who fell under who as far as the structure?
No, again, they're because they're completely their entire focus is the emperor, and that's everything in the narrative is about the emperor. Mm-hmm. So we don't often get much insight into the hierarchy that existed underneath him. Not direct insight from their text, anyway. What's striking about the usurpers is that they feature so heavily in these texts that normally don't want to talk about anything other than the emperor himself. What you can see, and what I've done in some of my other published research, is to look at the panegyrists themselves, the people delivering those speeches. And that can give you quite an interesting insight into how the Roman civil hierarchy worked. They generally weren't soldiers, the people that wrote these speeches, just because being someone capable of writing a speech like this, you had to have had a very, very good education. You probably wouldn't have spent your life in the military. But they were generally very, very important people, often high up in the imperial bureaucracy, or they had very important government-funded jobs teaching rhetoric in cities of the empire. So by looking at how they used their speeches to advance their own careers, you can get a little bit of a sense of how the Roman bureaucracy worked. But in terms of, hard details about how the Roman military operated, I'm afraid the panegyrics are less helpful.
So what do you hope the book will do?
I hope this book will change the debate about the shape of the late Roman state, and that's quite a lofty ambition for it. But I alluded earlier to the idea that I think when people tend to write about the ideology of the late Roman state and what I guess you might call the military-industrial complex of the late Roman state, to use an anachronistic term, it's very much a model of Romans versus barbarians. And a lot of the way that people view military activity, view political change in this period, it's through the window of that particular model. What I hope this book will help to do is to show people that actually its conflict between Romans was one of the most important driving forces in late Roman history. And also to show people just how heavily our source material has been manipulated by these civil wars and these conflicts. I've come away from this book with now a very skeptical view of my sources. I take a very dim view of the veracity of lots of the sources I work with. And I hope that skeptical view will also be something that reaches out beyond what I've done, and that people begin to see the ways in which the need to legitimize successive imperial regimes massively affected every single part of their public face, their public output, and through that, the historians that wrote about them.
Can you speak to any difficulties you had in finishing the book and getting it published, and how you overcame those? And you mentioned the language part already.
Yeah, I mean, so the language was a big difficulty. I was very lucky in this book. It began life as I mentioned, as a doctoral project, and I was able to actually finish it as a book, as a finished product, while I was in receipt of a British Academy postdoctoral fellowship. So I got a grant for 3 years to undertake writing and research. So that removed an enormous potential obstacle, because the big thing that this book demanded was time. I spent a lot of time writing this book, and so having the space in which to do that as my main, as my day-to-day, rather than trying to do it around another job, around a heavy portfolio of teaching responsibilities as I have these days, working for a university. That was a big, time was the big obstacle, and that was the way in which I was lucky enough to overcome it. I mean, the other thing, and again, this is just it's a quite generic comment that I'm sure any writer of a book could make. But it's just a very, very difficult thing to keep that mass of material in your mind at one time and to produce something that is a single unified whole rather than this weird Frankenstein's monster of all these disjointed parts. Mm-hmm. There were times it was December, the autumn and winter of 2016 that I actually finally finished the manuscript of the book. And there were times I genuinely thought I might go crazy, just trying to bring all this material together and get it across that finish line and hand it over to the publishers so that it could go to print.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned research that you're doing. Do you know what your next writing project is, your next big one?
I don't know. I know where I would like to go, though. I would like to take the models that I developed in this book, models about how the Roman state operated, the models about how civil war affected the political process and also affected the writing of history and the way the past has been transmitted to us. I'd like to take those models and use them to look at the period of the 5th and 6th centuries and at that breakup of Roman power in the Western Roman Empire. Mm-hmm. As I think I've sort of intimated in what I've been saying already, I feel that civil war has not been given sufficient representation in that narrative, and I'd like to see that change.
So, where can people find the book, and where can they find your thoughts and writings online, say social media or such?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the book is available to buy online. You can buy it from Oxford University Press, the publishers. You can buy it over Amazon. If you are a member of an academic institution, you can also read the book online through Oxford Scholarship Online. So those are the best ways that you'll be able to access it. It's not going to be on bookshelves up and down in bookshops up and down the country. It's an academic monograph, so you're going to need to get yourself to a university library if you want to find a copy of it on library shelves. Mm-hmm. And if people want to sort of tune into what I'm doing online and so on, I think the easiest way to do that would be to follow me on Twitter. Mm-hmm. One of the nice things about having a name like mine is I'm not tricky to find on Twitter. There's only one Adrastos Omissi on Twitter. Mm-hmm. So do please follow me on Twitter. And again, the advantage of having a name like mine is if you Google me, what you'll find is me and my work. So it would be a pleasure to know that as a result of this interview, people did that and were reading some of my other published research.
Okay. Can you spell your name out for anyone?
I can, yeah, sure. It's Adrastos, and my surname is Omissi. As I say, any of your listeners ever meet another Adrastos Omissi, they can write to me and tell me.
That's all the questions I have. Do you have any final thoughts or words?
No, I don't think so. I think I've said everything I'd like to say. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for speaking with me.
Yeah, well, thank you for inviting me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
This podcast has been presented by War Scholar. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to visit warscholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com for more great interviews and military history information. Your visits help support this podcast. One of the best ways to provide feedback for this podcast is to rate me on iTunes. Please give me a good rating if you liked it, or feel free to give me a bad rating if you didn't. I'll use that feedback to make this a better podcast. You can also follow me on Instagram under Chris Alvarez War Scholar. That's Chris without an H, C-R-I-S. On Facebook under War Scholar, on YouTube under War Scholar 1945, and on Twitter under War Scholar. Thank you, and I hope you return to this podcast for more great military history.